Hello and welcome back to the Innovator Spotlight. We are cutting through the noise and going under the hood on African Startup Capital. And this is episode 4 of our series, African Startup Capital. And my guest today has worked through and across the continent, also the world, from Switzerland through Ghana and Nigeria. He's the founder and managing partner of BoxPlay Ventures. And more about him soon. Help me welcome a good friend, Daniel Kweku Merki. Daniel, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, Daniel, let's cut straight to the chase. You've had a very fascinating journey from finance all the way to innovation, from Ghana to Nigeria, and now you are shaping Africa's venture building landscape through BoxPlay Ventures. My question is, you began in investment banking before moving into startup and ecosystem building. What triggered that shift, and how did it reshape how you view business and investment now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. But I think maybe the first premise is that ultimately the investment bank I was working with was a very entrepreneurial investment bank, I would say. So it was called SAS Finance Group, or previously Strategic African Finance. And it was owned by Toby Afede. And so in addition to the standard investment banking services, we were also really doing project promotion, or you could call it private equity deals that Toby was initiating. So there was a lot of entrepreneurial drive in that company. And I don't want to necessarily state or preempt for Toby what his vision is, but the way I saw it at that time, we were really trying to drive the industrialization of Ghana through private sector means. And to some extent, you could probably say it's something like some of the dreams, aspiration of what Kwame Nkrumah wanted to achieve, right? Through government, we wanted to drive it through private sector means. Yes. And I think for me personally, part of the disillusion came in terms of how difficult it is to navigate government affairs. And yes. And then government affairs, especially, I was also looking at it. I'm like half Ghanaian, but half Swiss, grew up in Switzerland. So I was also new in the system. I didn't have the connects as at then, the connections. And I was like, okay, if we are experiencing that much struggles, let me say in quotes, then how difficult would it be for me to do some of these things if maybe I would venture out on my own? And that was the first part. And then over the eventual journey, my belief was more and more that like radical or very transformational change would not come through the system. That was my thought, that it would rather come through from outside the system. And ultimately, when you say outside of the system, that means bottom up through innovation. That was my core belief. And then the question was like, how can I contribute to that change, to that bottom up approach? And it's like through entrepreneurship, innovation, what can I bring to the table? And of course, it started first. My initial expertise was coming from finance, a little bit of maybe venture building, but on a different scale in private equity. And I was just wanted to do something where I can do that for startups and young entrepreneurs.
And what have you found so far? Is the bottom up approach more effective?
I mean, there's always different means. But the question is, what does somebody ultimately really want to do? And in terms of that transformation, which I guess both approaches in this instance wanted that transformation, I use the word believer. I usually don't necessarily like it for this, but I'm a strong believer that the bottom-up approach is the right approach. But of course, it could be that I'm blindsided based on what I'm doing. And I mean, there is also, I think that, but there's the government affairs or dealing with government policies, everything that comes with it. I mean, if you really want transformation, you cannot shy away from that. It's just a different entry route. And I really think that maybe that was not what I was thinking about back then, but I think starting small, finding solutions to niche problems, hitting traction, all of those things, I think that's very advantageous to go that route.
And speaking of starting small, solving solutions to niche problems, tell me a little about Nigeria. During your time at Nigeria, I understand you were at AHK. Did you, first of all, from the collaborations between German industry and Nigerian startups, what are some of the key insights that that period gave you about the realities of the African market, and how did those lessons show up in your work at BoxPlay today?
Yeah. I mean, when I went to Nigeria, I was like at AHK, which is the German Chamber representation in Nigeria, I was in Lagos. But I was an integrated expert, like via the German Economic Ministry. So I was then advising on the startup and innovation ecosystem in Nigeria. And I already knew what I wanted to do in terms of the venture builder. That was already the aim. So of course, I looked at it through a particular lens. And of course, the Nigerian ecosystem, very interesting in terms of course, the market size, their ability to storytell, and probably now in retrospect, also their heightened willingness to collaborate, I would say, in comparison to our ecosystem, which are all very interesting facts. If a scale-up would truly focus on solving problems from the ground up in Nigeria, and they are successful, they should be able to roll over the African continent. But I also didn't think that a lot of the startups truly had the primary ambition to solve the problem versus, let's say, maybe raising it at a certain valuation and growing the business in some direction. But for instance, payment is a good example. We have a lot of fintechs. There is a lot of noise around the fintechs. But when you are even in Lagos, there's still a lot of challenges around payment living there. There's so many challenges. So it's like, okay, where are all these companies if the problem is actually not yet solved? And of course, then you expand, but I think there was sufficient market still to fight for in Nigeria and solve the problem from the ground up. And if somebody cracks that nut, I feel like there is a lot of potential. But I also thought of Ghana as probably an easier starting launch pad for a scale-up at the very beginning. And probably if you can establish yourself within an Accra, quote, niche or a Ghana niche, and then raise funding before tackling the beast, I thought that could be an approach.
Yeah. Okay. I find it interesting, especially your pseudo comparison between the Nigerian ecosystem and the Ghanaian one. We've heard it a couple of times. Most identify Nigerians as more hungry. Let's talk a bit about your perception of these different ecosystems. So maybe you can even add to it. I know you've worked from Switzerland, Ghana, Nigeria. I don't know if you've worked in any other African countries, but from these three very different business cultures, how have those experiences influenced how you spot opportunities of founders that are worth backing?
It's a very interesting question. I think amongst the three, I've actually worked the shortest time, especially in like in Switzerland, actually. But of course, I grew up in Switzerland, and I think what I have from a Swiss approach, and what is generally a Swiss approach, is really long-term thinking. And yes, and everybody says that, but even in comparison to other places, I think the Swiss business mentality is really focused on is long-term thinking, is high-quality focus. And then you move to Nigeria, or I don't even want to say Nigeria. You go to Lagos, which has, the hustle and bustle, we all know, is I would say, a very competitive environment. Maybe if you look at the West, it's like the one, like when you have the West, you have US. I think it's the pond in the developing world, where it's like you have a lot of extremes, a lot of competition in Lagos, you find an overall market that is bigger than the entire Ghanaian market, right? From a GDP perspective, and and of course, Nigerians are. I mean, I'm stereotyping and it's a pseudo analysis to something, but I think they are great storytellers, and I think that shows even in that ecosystem. You can see like there is just a tradition of storytelling that enables them to create a vision, get people to buy in, and also probably is part of the source of like large scale ambitions. Now, in the Ghanaian sense, a lot of those things are very different. It's like we are I would say we are more conservative. Even people harboring big ambitions sometimes don't want to share the ambition. And I think actually in Ghana we have a lot of good businessmen. But my question would rather be whether it's the VC backable type of businessman. But then ultimately there is also always success stories. Like if you have certain success stories, if certain things work, you kind of breed a culture. So I still think there is room for transformation. And I think what Ghana has, not even from a startup or innovation perspective, but generally, I think Ghana has a lot of things that are aligned for Ghana. Like just historically, that just would enable things to be sparked in a positive way. I mean, coming from like first sub-Saharan African country to be independent, there's a lot of things that one can spark, but that I would say we are not currently doing to its fullest potential.
Yeah, I love it. And for those who don't know, Daniel is also part of a podcast series, great podcast series, Chain Africa podcast. So if you haven't listened to it, check it out. And Daniel, I'm hearing a lot about storytelling, even with Nigeria's ability to storytell versus Ghanaians being conservative and not even sharing their stories. And that's the reason why we are doing even a series like this. Tell me more about that, especially when it comes to startups and the ability to fundraise. Do you feel like this is one of the reasons why Ghanaians are not able to fundraise as much as Nigeria or other countries that are?
I mean, I think it's a factor, but then again, of course, if you compare to Nigeria, I think market size is a huge factor because, as I said, if Lagos on its own has a larger GDP than the entirety of Ghana, I think that's one thing. And the other thing is that in Nigeria, we have a crop of homegrown early stage investors that we don't have here in the same manner. And I also think that those investors understood storytelling as well. So there's also something that is driven from there, and there is a focus on getting the founder that has the ability to storytell and everything. But I think what is missing in that ecosystem, and it's also missing in ours, is like there's still that mentality of almost treating funding or a good funding round as the ultimate success or the finish line versus it being the starting line. So I think there's a lot of challenges in that ecosystem too from that aspect. And I think one of the ultimate reasons why we have some of these challenges is because despite everything, a lot of the larger funding pots are not African funding pots. A lot of the investors are not African. And therefore, I think it kind of predetermines what kind of challenges, like solutions to challenges can be funded. And I think that's a big problem. Because there's certain businesses that the questions you receive around it about market viability, and a lot of them, it's very clear to us that there isn't market, even if there is no statistic backing it, because our markets are very fragmented. So it's hard to find that statistic. But of course, it's like, that's why I think, like, of course, fintech, for instance, it's a fundamental layer for many other businesses. But aside of that, it's also, I think it's something that the investors easily understand. Oh, X% of the population are unbanked. Great, they need to be banked. But do they really need to be banked? I think over the last years, we have seen not necessarily. There can be other solutions. But then even like it's something that the investors can easily wrap their head around. But then there's a lot of other things that I think what we require is a crop of successful startup founders that have built in Ghana, right, and have an exit eventually, and then also would be willing to reinvest, give back to the startup ecosystem. And I think that would immediately show a different approach. It would immediately get a different type of founder that can solve certain problems. Right?
Yeah, I get it. And even in your submission, you mentioned briefly about VDL, which is VDL Fulfillment, one of BoxPlay's early investments. You've made comparisons to how outside investors probably understand easy sectors like fintech. VDL might not be the typical one. So what drew you to that company, and what have you learned through that partnership?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that was my first real investment. So I got very lucky, right? It was a $25,000 investment and has been going strong, and it's still going strong. So I think of course, I probably have to acknowledge there's some element of luck there that it went that way. From my perspective, not from the VDL perspective. But then because I was investing very early stage and I was investing my own money, my core focus was on the founder. And when I say it was on the founder, it was on two aspects. It's the aspect of integrity. I think that was very key for me. And the second aspect was humility, true humility. And I think startup founders need that weird combination of being very humble, being ready to listen to everybody's perspective, always willing to be wrong, always willing to adjust. But at the same time, have that confidence that they will figure things out.
Love with what you're doing as well. So how do they balance the two? They have to be in love with what they are doing and ruthlessly believe in it as well. So how do they combine the two?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I'm saying this is so special, that you have to have that humility and that confidence. But I think ultimately, it's probably what you're saying. It's like, to some extent, you are that so fueled by truly wanting to solve that problem, right? That you are trying to solve, that you are interested in everything you hear. You want to hear every aspect of it. And then there's the other part where the problem is just so important to you that it just is like, it has to be solved. So it kind of eliminates the question marks. But I think it's a certain type of person. There's different types within that category, again, obviously, subcategories. But there is something that person has to bring to the table, right? To be, because the humility shows the irrational, and the other part shows that, I mean, you are willing to take that risk, you are daring, you are willing to go against the odds. So it's a special combination. And maybe to elaborate, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Finish that.
Yeah, and I was saying that, and that's also why ultimately I think, despite all our talks around, of course, capital and all the other ingredients you need to do a startup, I think the scarce resource is always that entrepreneur, that visionary, daring entrepreneur.
I agree. Yeah. No matter how startups in Ghana or Africa might face it, the human resource is more scarce than even capital. Let's talk a bit about venture building. BoxPlay is also not a typical VC or accelerator, right? It's more, from what I understand, it's a venture builder. So what gap did you see in Africa's startup ecosystem that made you use this model, and why do you think this model works?
I mean, I would say it's a lot of the things that we have already been talking around, but and then ultimately, I mean, I don't see myself as an investor in it, which I see myself as somebody who has also selected a problem. So I'm an entrepreneur, and the problem that I want to solve is that early stage financing of entrepreneurs in Ghana, in Africa. And when I say of entrepreneurs, it's that daring, visionary founder, yes. But I think there's also a component that the people that are closest to the problem and have experienced it the most, they understand the problem the best. They have the most hunger to solve that problem. But those founders might not necessarily always fit in the mold that the venture capitalist or a foreign investor could invest in. But it's to build a system, an investment approach, an investment system that is really geared towards the local context. And that's what I wanted to build. And the belief was that we would have the ability to spot entrepreneurial talent that has that creativity, has that storytelling ability, has that daringness, everything that comes with it, but sometimes would lack exposure. So we felt like, yes, we can combine that, come in with the support on more of the boring side of business, right? More of the governance part, the accounting, all the things that maybe coming from a Western perspective, like myself, even like would you feel like that's the easier part. But then it's always what you are exposed to. So naturally, you would see that those people that come from those backgrounds that I described, they would be very good at problem solving, very good at creativity. So that's not the challenging part in quotes. The challenging part is rather the more traditional aspects of business to also have that. So we felt like, we can bring that to the board. And I think over time it has also evolved or gotten more nuanced of how I see that we can do this as a venture builder. And I think VDL that you mentioned before is kind of has become like in my brain the prototype of what we could do, also in terms of capital efficiency, right? Using like a $25,000 check to really stretch it out, also take advantage of the fact that there is a lot of grant money floating in the system, but how can you leverage that grant money to actually move you forward, stretch your capital further, and then eventually really raise at a higher valuation once you have some real product market fit.
Is that what you call the corporate co-founder concept? Tell me a bit more about that. What does it really mean? So you mentioned a bit of admin side, but how is it from team formation to growth and governance?
Yes, I mean the corporate co-founder, when I wrote that piece around the corporate co-founder and how to think around it, we hadn't done any investment, right? That's even pre any investment that I thought around it. And I think one of the main things that I would say that is like that differentiation from being an investor versus being an actual also founder and an entrepreneur. So, and I could see that question. I had a lot of back in Lagos and then also from other avenues. I had like early stage investors in my circle. And when I made the VDL investment, the questions they asked me were very focused on the risk side of things. But my thinking was very different. And for me, it was like, okay, once I had ticked the box in terms of the integrity, once I had ticked the box in viability of business model, market potential, and also that ability and willingness to learn, that humility that I pointed out. Once I tick those boxes, I was like, okay, I'll give you the money. I'm part of the team. I'm looking forward. I don't care about those risks. It's like, we are going for it. That was the that was the mentality. And I think the corporate co-founder is pointing at that particular mentality, right? That it's not, once we are with you, we are no longer, we can de-risk, but we are not de-risking for ourselves. We are de-risking for us as an entity. We are part of it.
Okay.
We're not de-risking for if it fails, how could we pull back some 50% of our investment or anything like that. That's not our thought process.
I like that. Tell me a bit more about your philosophy at BoxPlay. I've heard a few times that your manifesto is usually about solving Africa's biggest challenges through transformational startups. So what's exactly embedding those principles and how do they influence your investment and partnership decisions? I see a bit in the answers that you are giving, but let's hear it. What's the BoxPlay philosophy and manifesto?
I mean, that's an interesting one. I was smiling because it's like, it's almost, somebody could almost say that's a contradiction, right? You start bootstrapped with small capital, yet you're pointing out you want to solve the biggest problem. But I think part of it, I mentioned it comes from the belief that the people that are best positioned to solve the problems are the ones experiencing it. And therefore, they might not always fall in that mold. So one thing or one key ingredient we have pointed at is the founder. So how do we find those founders? But then there's also some other things that I strongly believe in terms of spotting businesses. It's like, I think there is a lot that can be done with business model innovation, and then using or leveraging technology to solve these create those business model adaptation solutions versus deep tech at this stage. And then one of the things that I also see is our markets are usually extremely fragmented. And I see a lot of founders, businesses, startups that are trying to solve some of these things from the supply side. Because maybe, you have a certain amount of post-harvest losses. So you want to go and solve it on the supply side. My belief is that for many of these systemic challenges, my approach would rather be to solve it from the demand side. And when I say that is like identify a small niche where you can corner a small market, ideally a high-paying market, right? So, for instance, if you look at the farm produce example, right, I would rather, for instance, look at, okay, in Accra, there is expatriates that want fresh produce. They are willing to pay extra money, maybe for brown paper bag or for organic produce. They're willing to pay certain extra monies for certain things. Their access is supermarkets, very overpriced, still limited options, sometimes even not that great of quality. So if you could start from if you could aggregate that and have that demand, and then opportunistically supply, and then figure out, okay, what does that market exactly want, and then basically integrate backwards towards the supply side later, I think that's a more promising approach for many of the challenges. But I think people's natural instinct is I want to go and solve those issues around the supply. And my belief is that, no, the supply is fragmented because there is not one core, easily identifiable, ready, accessible market where you can bring it to and get. And I know immediately when I get to this place in Accra, I'll get 15 cedis, 50 pesos for my produce per kilogram. That's it. I don't think I think the problem is rather that, and it's counterintuitive to some extent, but I think that is rather the best approach to go around those problems. So that's one thing that I strongly believe. And also, that's why I also believe in the starting small, because we can now figure out, hit traction in those smaller markets, and then move towards the other pieces. So I think that's one of the core beliefs, that it's not necessarily high tech, it's business model innovation. And that's business model innovation that doesn't necessarily need to go into the newest market. It's rather that you can go into traditional markets and unlock the market, says, like aggregate it, and then also leverage technology to be superior in cost efficiency and many other things.
Business model innovation, I love it. And you've begun running mini incubator programs just to generate deal flow. How do these work, and what type of founders or ideas tend to thrive in them, for example?
Yes, I mean, one of them is sitting right next to me, actually, but I will give you a little bit of an elaboration. I mean, we started as BoxPlay. We started an innovation hub, which is called Venture Nest, which I'm sitting at here at the moment. It's in Osu. And the reason why we did the Venture Nest is because, we realized, of course, we need to build the ecosystem. We need to have deal flow, not just from a startup perspective, but even deal flow from where are those founders coming from? How can we find them? And now, one of the things I always keep mentioning is like, we have talent, but they need more exposure. So we started a Venture Nest innovation program, and it's basically to give them that exposure. And I think the ultimate what we do is we are very hands-on. We know that they need a lot of exposure. They need a lot of time. We know that it's not done by doing those Saturdays or a 4-hour session, but we have to be there. We have to have the WhatsApp group, provide more content, connect them to guys like you, have another person, give more exposure, spend a lot of time on enabling them to grab that exposure, right? And the first Venture Nest innovation program, I would say, was really more our MVP. So we weren't really strict even on sector, stages. Like, of course, it was from idea to launch, but we were quite open and then try to treat it like a startup, right? An MVP. The second Venture-Nest Innovation Program will kickstart somewhere in Q1 2026, and it will actually be focused on climate tech and sustainability. The sector focus will be switching, but it's like, yeah, we drew certain lessons and we are now adjusting them, but it's the same thing. We want to create funnels from very early on, right? I was involved with, we were partnering with Junior Achievement. So from high school, then we have a program with Junior Achievement and the Stanbic Incubator that is a lot focused on tertiary students. And my belief is like, we need to spot the entrepreneurial talents early, and then always for the scale ups, we need the top 1%, top 2% of all these programs, and keep giving them more and more and more exposure. And then also, of course, like merge them and combine them with the right talent. What I mean with that is like, yeah, you might have somebody that doesn't have the technical expertise, but we are also building the flow of where is the right CTO for you, where is the business guy, the sales guy that is entrepreneurial and you can match with. So ultimately, what we are building here at the Venture Nest is, what we want to build is a melting pot where everybody in the ecosystem comes together. When I say everybody, it's like, I used to be very critical of grants, despite coming from a space that was more on the grant giving side as well. But now I realize like that it's not the right attitude to point at the shortfallings. It's rather the right thing to, how can we utilize it to achieve impact and do the right thing? So I want to bring even those guys into the Venture Nest, bring the investors, bring the early stage founders, and then really make it a place where we can come together, find solutions, and make it a nest, yes, for those founders to get that exposure and start building startups. And then we can also support with some level of funding for the right match.
Yeah, and speaking of grants, you've mentioned a few times that venture building can take up to 10 years before major returns. How does BoxPlay sustain itself whilst building for the long term?
Yeah, that's probably from my perspective, what I was driving as a founder. That's probably the biggest mistake I was doing, and probably the most naive. I was very, very focused only on the long term. I mean, you could see even when we really kickstarted BoxPlay, we immediately came out with a 5-year master plan that we released, and I was telling my employees, don't focus on the income, like think long term, which of course is somewhat required, but then at the same time, of course, you need to have some level of operational income to support the support system. And right now, the way we are doing this, or how it has evolved, is we have 3 main layers that we want to use as services to fund our operations. Number 1 is ecosystem consulting. So as an example, we did some e-commerce mapping report for GIZ for one program of the German Development Corporation. That could be one example of that could be ecosystem consulting. Then the second one is capacity building. And we also want to monetize some aspects of it. Could be through grants, but also through some other means. And basically, in our example, the capacity building is now, that's Venture Nest. So it's actually a standalone business, but I would say still, when you look at the overall, that's the second service pillar. And the third one is venture building as a service, where we can also execute, consult, do certain support functions for people starting their businesses. So I think those are the 3 main pillars. But our focus on these things came too late. So last year, so 2024 was really the year to suffer and break through. And we got something at the very end that opened up one of it and made it clear. And then from there, we built the other parts. And I think right now, this 2025 is the year where we unlocked quite a few of those things. And once we unlocked those things, we had to also realize we had to put all our energy and focus on that. So somewhat the early startup investing, what I'm really passionate about, had to kind of take some level of a backseat. But I'm very, very excited that now is like I have some capital geared up, and at this stage we are able and ready to go back into building hopefully VDL 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0.
Love it, love it. We've spoken a bit about strategy, also mentioned a bit about pipeline. Let's talk more about ecosystem collaboration to increase pipeline. So, for example, governments, universities, you mentioned doing something with GIZ. How can these organizations, even Innovation Spark, right, work with venture builders like BoxPlay to strengthen the African startup pipeline and make it even more quality? Yeah.
Yeah, true. I mean, that's an interesting one because more and more that's what I'm seeing, that we want to be that pipeline. But obviously, we can't be that pipeline. We can only be that pipeline as an ecosystem to really make it work. And ultimately, I guess that's where everybody has a contribution to make. And the thing is, I think it's just more transparency and more collaboration so that we don't do the same mistakes. What I mean is like, because I mean, we have founders that are taking advantage of the system because of the silos, right? But we could easily avoid that if there would be more transparency among the supporters. And also that understanding that the Nigerians had, I don't see it. The Nigerians had the understanding that a real success of one lifts all of them up. I think that is kind of missing. But I think we are gradually, not fast enough at this stage, but we are gradually wrapping our heads around it, right? And yes, and therefore I'm quite confident that we can solve it. And from the BoxPlay perspective, from the beginning, in that 2023 to 2027 master plan that we put out, the end goal was to raise a fund, and almost as if that fund would be the starting line. So basically, all this while was like product market fit or founder venture investor kind of fit, creating that pipeline. And then once we have that pipeline bootstrapped by ourselves, the reason being, because we don't want to go the pathways that are shown by the bigger funds, right? We want to do it our way based on the local insights that we are getting. And that's why I'm calling us not an investor, but we are also founders, entrepreneurs that are trying to solve that problem of early stage financing. What's the right model? Once we get the model, then we of course also want to have a fund so that we can fuel those startups and enable them to become scale-ups. And that's also something that we are working at actively now. It's actually the aim is probably a bigger fund than I initially anticipated, because I think we are building that pipeline. And once we build that pipeline, I mean, Innovation Spark is, from my perspective, like a very, very critical ecosystem supporter, entrepreneurship supporter, just because we mentioned that storytelling, putting things out there, but also because there's a lot of research, a lot of information, and that's ultimately what we also need to professionalize and attract certain investors, is for them to actually know what's truly going on the ground and give some exposure to all of us. And I think it's the same thing when you look for across all these like the GIZs of this world and everything. Despite some of the things that I've said before, I think the talk of, or the mentioning of, real impact is increasing. But I think for them as well, it's almost as if they also have to figure out the right model, right? Because they have been financing other things in the past, and some of these stringent approaches don't necessarily work. I mean, I had a discussion last week, Thursday, with somebody, a representative of the German Development Corporation, right? And one statement he made was like, they're realizing that the very best, the real builders, they don't come for their programs, they don't approach them. And that he mentioned to some people within the organization that they have to go and chase them. But then there's challenges on the procurement front and everything that doesn't work with the traditional systems they have, right? So there's a lot of things to think around, but I think ultimately we then play a role, right? We could be those aggregators that make those selections, like increase the viability, the integrity, the everything that is required, so that we make the work for some of these other stakeholders easier, rather than to point at what more they could do, because ultimately they are putting a lot of money into the system, they are doing a lot of things. So ultimately, I guess it's our job to see how we can improve these things.
Well, Daniel, we have just 5 minutes to round up. I'm speaking with Daniel Merki of BoxPlay Ventures. And Daniel, you've been teasing a bit about the 5-year master plan that you set out to do. From what I understand, you've done about 3 years of it. Can you give us a glimpse of what's next in terms of success, regions, and even your ambition?
Yes, of course. Maybe to just quickly say that master plan, I mean, it was like a 30+ page document. We maybe went a bit overboard at that stage because my focus, as I mentioned, was very long-term driven. But the 4 milestones were: 1, building out BoxPlay services. So that would point at the operational stuff where we can make some revenues and finance and support our startups. 2 was creating that venture building methodology through programs like what we are now doing with the Venture Nest Innovation Program. 3 was to leverage those startups to help them raise grants and other funding to extend.
Okay.
And then 4 was then eventually building that fund. I think we are doing quite well. It was like, it's that thing where year 1, you fall behind, you're wondering where it's getting. Year 2, and then in year 3, all of a sudden, a lot of the things are just falling in place. But then you realize, of course, that's how it's supposed to work. And the next steps is, for me, is I've been doing a lot of work in the dark, a lot of like little things, trying to piece things together. But I think I'm just at the verge of having, like, probably from an entrepreneurship perspective, from my personal perspective, a very exciting phase of where I can actually start building new ventures. And actually, when you look at the BoxPlay Ventures website, there is a future projects section where actually there is some brief on some of these projects that we want to engage in. And some of them, of course, I would also finance like through my holding company, and has like a different set of investors, but BoxPlay will be driving a lot of it. And so there's a number of projects that I'm pursuing, but it's all around that philosophy that I laid out. I mean, the fragment where that mismatch of supply and demand, but rather tackling it from the demand side, then creating more visibility, more systems around, making it easier for people on the demand side to actually buy, making them access to market easier, not for the suppliers, but for the buyers. And then eventually on the other side of the supply, doing some level of survival of the fittest, who can then supply and then go down that route. So I think there's a lot of things coming on. I started out from investment banking, and one of the projects is actually also going back towards something in the investment banking brokerage space, and also, like, of course, with some level of innovation and digital trading tools and so on. So I think there is quite a lot. But ultimately, I think you pointed at it, in all these things, it's not one person, it's not one organization. We just need to find the right visionaries combined with the young ones, I would say. And if we truly have that desire to then solve the problems from the ground up, I think the sky is the limit.
That's Daniel Merki of BoxPlay Ventures with out-of-the-box thinking. Daniel, thank you for your time. How can founders and ecosystem players connect with you or learn more about BoxPlay Ventures and the programs you're doing?
I mean, I mean, I've mentioned the website, but I think the place that we are most active from a social media perspective is LinkedIn. Whether myself as Daniel Kweku Merki, whether BoxPlay Ventures, whether the Venture Nest, I think that's a good source. And then beyond that, now, of course, we have a physical hub, so founders are very welcome to reach out and then pass through the Venture Nest. You can see I'm here. You can see the Venture Nest Innovation Program banner. You can see a few of the logos in the background, right? From the VDLs to the BoxPlays to our Change Africa podcast. So we are here. Very happy to connect, collaborate, build, and just move the system forward and really build solutions from the ground up together with anyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel Merki. Like you said, check them out on BoxPlay Ventures, their website, or connect with them on LinkedIn, BoxPlay Ventures, or also search for their other venture called Venture Nest. Daniel is also very relatable on LinkedIn as Daniel Kweku Merki. Check out his podcast as well, Change Africa Podcast. They've had some amazing stories there. I've personally learned a lot listening to their podcast. So I definitely recommend it. And that's where we end it for Africa Startup Capital, episode 4. Daniel, thank you so much. Speak soon.
Thanks so much. Speak soon.